LSN in the log, but each page keeps track of the latest LSN that changed data on that page. Insert, update, or delete. Here again, when we're talking about update, it's insert, update, or delete. So the most recent LSN for any change to that page, just the most recent. The system also keeps track of something called the flushed LSN. It's called the flushed LSN because we don't want our database system to go into the toilet. What is the flushed LSN? Well, here's something really important. Flushing of the log has to be something where you flush log pages in order. You don't have any gaps. If I have flushed LSN 107, all the LSNs less than 107 have been flushed. If I have flushed log record 942, all the LSNs less than 942 have been flushed. No gaps. So I have a bunch of log flight pages. I will write my log pages and all the log pages before them that haven't already been flushed. So I have something, and it's just a single value kept by the system. What is the latest LSN that I know has been flushed? Got the concept right? Page LSN, the last log record for an update to that page. Flushed LSN, the last log record that I know has been flushed out to persistent storage. And now, remember what we talked about, write-ahead log, and that condition number 1 on write-ahead log. Let me show you that, and then we'll go back. Condition number 1, must force the log record for an update before the corresponding page gets written to disk. One more time. I will not write a page to disk. I promise, I promise, I promise. I won't write a page to disk until the log records that involve changes to that page have made it out to disk. Everybody cool on that? The concept? And now, these two word notions over here, page LSN and flushed LSN, allow me to express condition number 1 very elegantly and simply. To be able to get condition number 1 on write-ahead log, what's required is that before a page is written, before I will force a page out to disk or other persistent storage, its page LSN must be less than or equal to the flushed LSN. What the heck is that saying? Before I write a page out to disk, every log sequence number that corresponds to a change to that page must already have been flushed out to disk. Let me say that again because it's exactly condition number 1 on the other page. Before I can write a page out to disk, every change that has occurred on that page, every log record describing a change to the page, must have been flushed out to the log. Page LSN, the last change, log record describing a change on that page, must be less than or equal to the last thing that I flushed, meaning I flushed all the log records that correspond to changes to that page. This statement is exactly the same as number 1. But it allows me a really efficient way of keeping track of whether or not it's true. So what I will have to do before I can write it a page is increase flushed LSN if necessary. If page LSN is greater than flushed LSN, what do I have to do? Gotta flush more of the log. Flushed LSN is not a constant. I get to affect that by flushing more of the log. So I have to make sure that I flush more of the log so that flushed LSN is greater or equal to page LSN. And there are some things about doing this and making sure that things don't change underneath you if there were more changes going on the page that are tricky, but you get the general idea of what's going on. The key thing here is every change that I've made on the page, the log records for that page have made it out to disk before I ran out that page. That's all that said. Everybody cool? even people who aren't looking at the screen? Okay, that's all that says. Pretty simple. By the way, what about condition 2? We haven't mentioned that, but condition 2 says we must write all log records for a transaction before it commits. You know how we deal with that one? As we're about to see, there is a record which is called the commit record that you write at the end of the transaction. The transaction doesn't commit until you have the commit record forced out to disk. That is what the transaction commit is. That's really what says that the transaction committed, when the commit record for the transaction has been forced out to disk. When do you write the commit record for a transaction? After you finish doing all the actions in the transaction, and the transaction has been asked to commit. The commit record goes into the log after all the log records from the transaction, right? You don't get to write the commit record until all the log records for the transaction are in the log. So when you flush the commit record, all the log records before it have been flushed out to disk. So you write the commit record at the end of the transaction to the log. The commit has to be forced out to disk for the transaction to commit. And when it's forced out to disk, all the log records before it have been forced out to disk. Because remember, log is a sequence where you must force everything before you force everything out. If I've written commit record is log record number 932, everything before 932 has already made it out to disk. You can't flush the commit before flushing all the things in the log before, and all of the records of the transaction must be before the commit. You can't have the log records for a transaction coming out after the commit. You make sure that all the log records of the transaction go out before the commit record. Clear? So number 1 is basically saying that thing, that page LSN is less than or equal to flush LSN. And number 2 is basically when you write the commit record, you make sure all the log records from the transaction have made it out to the log. And then you write the commit record and you ensure the commit record is flushed, which means all the records before it have been flushed. Right ahead log. Simple, no? Not entirely, but you get the idea. There are other ways that you can ensure what we're talking about here. This is a really simple one. And we'll talk about how it actually works in detail both today and, so I've got another 9 minutes, and continuing on. So any questions before I go on? There can be records in the log that haven't made it out to disk yet. But you gotta follow the rules. The law, which is log spelled backwards, as I've already pointed out. You're disagreeing. Is that wrong?
You're not wrong.
Thank you. I'm just bad.
Yes.
As promised at the beginning of both 180 and 181. But I told you the jokes would be new. Most of them are. What do you have inside a log record? Okay. You have something which is, again, when there's an update, insert and delete, you have the stuff about the page, the length, the offset. There are other games involving RNDs that may be played. And you have the before image, which is the old values, and the after image, which is the new values. But as I mentioned, if I'm only updating 2 attributes, I don't have to have the entire record. I can just have the things that changed. Because undoing is going back to the old value, and redoing is just going to the new value, the after image. There are some other fields that I have inside a log record. I have information about the transaction that wrote it. I have the type of the log record. There are some other log record types besides update, insert, and delete. We're going to see on the right side of this page. And I also have something called prev LSN. What does prev LSN mean? I have a linked list of all the log records that correspond to this transaction. What is that going to allow me to do? I can undo the transaction by following that linked list. In memory, I'll keep track of the most recent log record for this transaction. So if I have to undo it, I have transaction 47. The log sequence number for it was, 712. I'll have to undo 712, which will point the previous LSN to the next log sequence number for that transaction. So I don't have to read through the entire log to find the things on behalf of this transaction. I've got a link list to them that I can follow to find them. And of course, when I get to the last log record, the transaction prevalence n is null or 0 or whatever. So I'll be able to follow that link list to be able to do it. Okay, so that's in this version what a log record looks like. And by the way, there is no standard for log records. Every system implements the details of its log records a little bit differently, because nobody shares their log record formats with anybody else. They can play with all kinds of compression and optimization and all kinds of other games, but there's no standard for log records in detail, although they're all variations on a theme. You know, basically, what are the log record types? Well, there's something which is an update, which includes insert and delete are just special updates. There's a commit record, better be, to say that the transaction committed. There is a rollback record, which basically said somebody caused this transaction to roll back, I don't have to undo it. There's an end record, which we'll be saying more about, which is something that says that I've done everything that was needed to handle the commit or rollback. It's helpful for not having to do everything again and again and again, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There is the most interesting of these types, which is the CLR, which is the compensation log record. And we'll get to it. Remember last time, or maybe the time before, I mentioned the hardest part of any of these algorithms for crash recovery is handling crashes that happen during crash recovery. And if you're writing a crash recovery algorithm that doesn't handle that, you haven't done your job. This is the hardest part of this algorithm, so CLRs are the most interesting. And again, there are variations, but basically, you have to play with undoing actions or in a certain way. Again, we'll come to see what a CLR thing is about and how it plays in. So those are the types of records in the arrays algorithm. Now there's a state that is kept. Oh, before I leave this, when I write a rollback record to the log, well, reminder, when I write a commit record to the log, I have to force the commit record, which means forcing everything before, right? We've seen why, because that allows me to redo condition number 2 on the right-hand log. When I write a rollback record, do I have to force the log? How many think yes? How many think no? How many are waiting until they take 181 again? Or redo? I don't have to force the rollback record. Because if the transaction, if there's a system failure, active transactions are going to get undone anyway. So if my rollback record hasn't made it out to disk, I'm still okay because I've got write-ahead log. My rollback record may not have been written out there, but everything that's been done on disk that's supposed to get undone, the log records for it will have been forced because of the write-ahead log. The log records for it will have been written to disk, so I will be able to undo everything that's made it out to disk. I do not have to force when there's a rollback. I do not have to force when there's a rollback. There are data structures that we're going to be talking about, and we'll be finishing those next time. I still have about 3 minutes left. Good. So I'll get to talk about this, and we'll be ready to talk about checkpoints soon. I have what's called the transaction table, which gives me information about every active transaction. Sometimes you even keep it about committed transactions for a while, but we'll just talk about active transactions. And what does that include? For each transaction, it includes the transaction ID. It includes a status, which is running, committed, or rolled back. And it includes the last LSN. Anybody ever guess what last LSN is?
The last thing that flushed?
The last log sequence number that's associated with the transaction, whether it flushed or not. The last, but it's a good guess. LSN is the log sequence number. It is the last log sequence number that's associated with the transaction, which may or may not have been flushed so far. It's the last LSN associated with the transaction. I told you there were going to be a bunch of LSN things in the LSN family. Then there's what's called the dirty, filthy page table, or probably just dirty page table, it doesn't have to be filthy. And basically, it's gonna have one entry for each dirty page in the buffer pool. You only have to have it for the dirty pages. What's a dirty page? A page which has changed since you read it in. Remember we played with this dirt bit and the pin count? So dirty page, dirt bit is true. So you have a dirty page table, and it includes something called the REC record LSN. And here's the interesting thing about that one. The rec LSN is the LSN of the log record which first dirtied the page. First dirtied the page. Okay? So now we have the dramatis personae or play. So normally when you execute a transaction, you do a bunch of reads, a bunch of writes, you have log records that are generated for the updates, inserts, and deletes, which are basically writes, right? And then you follow with a commit or a rollback. And we'll assume that when you write a page to disk, we will assume that writing is going to be atomic. Now, I just want to mention one amusing little detail on this. You know, again, we're going to start off, we're going to go through this again next time, next Wednesday. Remember that the log is an append-only thing? So suppose that I've written half of the contents of the page, and now I decide, well, I've got all this room on the page. I don't want to waste it. I don't want to make my log arbitrarily long. What I want to do is I've written 2,000 bytes of my 4K page, and now I want to write more stuff, and I'm going to write another 2K to the page. Okay? What's dangerous about doing that? This writes may fail. So I wrote my first 2K, and it had a commit record for a bunch of stuff, and a bunch of log records for a bunch of stuff that I care about undoing as well. And I wrote 2K, and now I want to write my next 2K. But that write fails. Well, tough luck for my second 2K, but the first 2K, I had committed transactions and things I needed to undo that were on that page where I regarded it as, you know, I forced out the stuff I needed to force out. I wiped out my first 2K. But I had an obligation associated with that 2K. It's a year 2K problem showing up in another form. I had an obligation to that 2K that was in that page, and by writing out the page again, if there's a crash after my medium failure, you know, happened, then I'm in trouble. Several ways that gets dealt with. I'll give you one example of it quickly. There are others. I have 2 copies of the log. And what I do is I alternate writing to them. So I write my first copy of the log. Assuming that works, I'll write my second copy of the log. And now, the next time, what I will do is I'll write other changes to my second copy, and then I'll write to the first copy. What's happening is, it's a way of ensuring that I can at least get an undo. If one of the writes fails, the other one is still okay. I don't do them in parallel. I do one and then the other, one and then the other. Which means that if I had that first 2K that was out there and I write my second 2K and things fail, I still have a copy that's good that has the stuff that I was obligated to write there. We'll talk a little bit more about this next time. You have a long weekend. Please start going to the labs to start looking at and thinking about log 4. And